Hello students, this is our Biology 102 online course. I'm George Pinchuk. We are continuing our course and we are switching to a new series of lectures under the general topic evolution. Today we're going to go over the history of the evolutionist teachings in biology. It's pretty interesting that if you ask randomly 100 people from the street, who was the first person who started to talk about evolution, and probably 90 or so out of the 100 will say Darwin. And this is not true. The idea that life forms change over time, that life today is not exactly like life was 1 million years ago or 10 million years ago, is not Darwin's. That idea was started to shape in ancient Greece in the 5th century before Christ, before our era. A Greek philosopher. Back then, you couldn't call any person scientist, because back then there was no clear-cut distinction between philosophy, mathematics, geology, biology, etc. There were groups of people who were generally called philosophers, from the Greek term philosophia, means love of wisdom. So one of these wisdom lovers was a man called Thales. He lived in an ancient city of Miletus, which is modern-day Turkey, the Aegean Sea coast. Back then, it was called Asia Minor, and the western part of what is now Turkey was heavily populated by Greek colonists. Many Greek city-states produced some philosophers, lovers of wisdom, who were also very keen observers of the natural world. And one of these philosophers, Thales, in the 5th century BC, taught that all substances have been and are being formed from water. That was one of these hypotheses that were advanced by philosophers trying to answer to the question, what is, like what exists, what is the stuff that is the basis of everything. And some argued that it's fire, others argued that it's apeiron, some kind of immaterial substance. But Thales argued that water is the basis of everything. And he said, well, you see, water can evaporate, and whatever is dissolved in water crystallizes, so you see salt. Also, water hydrates the soil, and you see the grass growing, etc. And so basically, it all comes from water. In his mind, it all comes from water. And he hypothesized that life forms also, they originated in very, very ancient times, millenniums over millenniums ago, by some kind of transformation of water. And it was gradual. First, some very simple creatures evolved from water, like slime, mold, something like this. And then from those creatures, more complicated creatures evolved, and more complicated creatures evolved. And and so on and so forth. And finally, we see life on Earth as it is today. But it's all the product of evolution, and the primary substance from which everything evolves is water. Uh, Thales uh, was criticized by many in his day and in centuries after him. In the 4th century BC, so about 100 years after Thales, a great Greek philosopher, really colossal genius. You can view him as founder of botany, zoology, to large extent also geology, geography, and what we today view as branches of science. Aristotle. Aristotle said that mm, I don't agree with ancient lovers of wisdom like Thales of Miletus. It's all fantasies, you know. He has no basis of judging for judgment like this, that yesterday life forms were like this and today they are like that, and that's because of the evolution. Aristotle, his main sort of field of study generally was motion. His basic question was, does motion exist, and what if it does, what is the reason for motion? What moves things? And he developed this famous line of reasoning that if there are two stones and they collide, then one of them moves one way, the other moves the other way, and so the stones are the reason of this particular trajectory, movement of the stones after collision. And he, continuing this line of reasoning, he asked this question. So, if like I am a mover of a stone, the stone hits another stone, and so that stone is the mover of that second stone. Who or what is the primer mover? What force, or what, if you want, person is the originator of all movement in the world that surrounds us? And he was probably the first European mind, European philosopher who offered this idea of a creator. You see, in Greek mythology, gods existed, but they were not creators. They did not create anything. Actually, they were themselves. They were created from some sort of chaos. And in the Greek mind of the times of antiquity, the 5th century, 4th century BC, the world was just a series of transformations which had no particular primary cause. Like the world is something that exists, it always has existed, it will always exist, it just changes forms. And Aristotle was probably the first philosopher, in at least in European Western philosophy, who said no, the world was not always here. The world is the product of the movement caused by the primary mover of everything, God, creator. And then, in line with this thought, Aristotle reasoned that if this primary mover of things is really so powerful that he can take care of everything, why would he first create primitive creatures and then sort of think a little and on other date create more complicated creatures, etc. He said, let's just postulate the simplest scenario. Those great, all-powerful, all-wise, um, all-reasoning, all-thoughtful creator simply created the world that we see now. Right? And all the life forms were created by his primary movement uh, in one day or 1 hour or 1 second, if you will, it doesn't matter, all at once. And since that time, nothing really changed because everything was already perfect. We're talking about all-powerful, almighty, all-wise creator. So Aristotle was the first denier of evolution. And then, of course, in the Christian era, the European Western thought moved toward theology, Christian theology, Judeo-Christian theology, and the book of Genesis, the opening book of the Bible, was generally accepted as the textbook of everything, like, or encyclopedia of all knowledge. And the opening lines of Genesis say, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth, and then on day 2 God created planets and stars, and then light, and then night and day, and then plants, and then animals, and finally humans. So that was taken on face value, and since there are no direct indications that plants gave rise to animals, and from animals evolved humans, etc. All these ancient evolutionist ideas were kind of buried. They were forgotten for a time. And of course, and Aristotle, with his idea of creator, especially beginning from the 13th, 14th century after Crusades, when Europe became acquainted with Arabic culture of the Middle East, and Arabs preserved many Greek sources, papyri with ancient Greek writings, and those were brought to the Western reader, and so there was this huge rediscovery of Aristotle, and Aristotle became the teacher, the philosopher. Everything that Aristotle wrote, because of his staunch creationism, was accepted as full truth and nothing but the truth, and evolutionary teachings were peacefully, or maybe not very peacefully, forgotten. Uh, Now let's go to modern, more modern times, newer times, in and look at these. Let's look at these two really great, amazing personalities, biologists, who lived in the 18th century. One of them, pictured in the upper left corner, was a Swede. His given name was Carl Linné, but he signed, of course, back then, scientists, actually all people with good education, wrote in Latin. Latin was the language, like lingua franca, the language of communication of learned men. And so he signed his name Carolus Linnaeus. And so we call him either Linny or Linnaeus. That's the same person. In the mid-18th century, Linny or Linnaeus published a book called The System of Nature. Very bold name, title, The System of Nature. And then a sequel of this was his other book called Philosophy of Botany. Uh, and these books, both of these books, were pretty amazing for that time because back then naturalists, uh, people who studied plants, animals, they simply described them. They described their appearance, habits, breeding, feeding, etc. But Linnaeus tried to classify the life, and he was the first uh, person who said, you know, let's give some order into this huge world of living things. There are living things that are more similar to each other, and there are those that are less similar to each other. For example, bears and pine trees are really different, but uh, bears and wolves, they're still different, but not as different as these animals compared to pine trees or grass or something. He introduced the system of classification, which included boxes, so to say, a very large box, which we now call domain. And to recall, there are domains, bacteria, archaea, and eukarya. Then within eukarya, there are kingdoms. There is animal kingdom, plant kingdom, the kingdom called fungi, right? The kingdom called protists. Those are still large boxes. You see, again, kingdom animals, animalia. This box contains, say, monkeys and sharks. On the first uh, view appearance, what can be possibly similar between a monkey and a shark? Well, they're both animals, right? So there are features that distinguish them from plants and fungi and protists. So they belong to the kingdom animals, animalia in Latin. Now, within this kingdom animalia, there are orders, right? Like there are let's recall what are there are invertebrate animals and vertebrate animals, and invertebrate animals include several phyla, like phylum mollusks, phylum porifera, so phylum flatworms, etc., etc. And vertebrates, they all belong to one phylum, chordates, but they have different orders, right? Like primates, monkeys, and apes. Certainly, these are different from fishes. Within fishes, there are bony fishes and cartilaginous fishes. So, so basically, Linnaeus introduced the system of boxes. Large box contains the hodgepodge of life forms. Within it, you can build smaller boxes where inhabitants of one of these small boxes are. They may still be different, but they are not as different as inhabitants of another box. Then within this smaller box, again, you can build even smaller boxes. And so this way, we go from something huge like domain to something smaller like kingdom, then to something smaller like class, order, uh, family, then genus, and then species. A species is the most, it's the smallest, the tiniest box where uh, inhabitants are very, very similar to each other, sometimes undistinguishable from each other. And Linnaeus offered to uh, use this, what we call binary classification. Uh, when we name some life form we call it by its genus and its species. Like, for example, if we want to name a wolf, right? The genus to which wolf belongs is, in Latin, it's canis, uh, creatures that are similar to dogs, right? So canis. And then the second name in this binary classification is the species name. So we say canis lupus. Lupus is wolf, literally. Right? So lupus or wolf belongs to genus Canis, species Lupus. Or when we want to name a mold that produces penicillin, there is a genus of molds which generally, overall, it is called Penicillium in Latin, and then there are several varieties within this genus, which are, we call them species. So this species that produces penicillin is called Penicillium notatum. And, so using this binary classification, we can have a pretty good idea where this creature belongs, what genus included. It's kind of like naming you by your last name and your first name. The name of the genus is basically your last name. Like if your last name is Smith, it means that there are other Smiths. You have siblings, you have parents, you might have children, so they are all distinct from you, but they are related to you, and that's why you guys, all of you, all your bunch is called by the same last name. But within this last name, there are first names. You know, Peter Smith is not like Jane Smith. Those are two different individuals, right? Although they belong to the same genus. So Peter and Jane are both species, and using the binary classification, we can call them Peter Smith and Jane Smith, except in in Linné's nomenclature, we always name a genus first and species next. Uh, okay, but why are we bringing this up here in this cycle of lectures about evolution? Linnaeus argued against evolution using his discovery of classification. So he argued that there is such a beautiful logical system in nature. Like that, there are, like you can build all these boxes and narrow down the identification of a creature to a certain kingdom, then class, then order, and family, and genus, and species. And it's so logical, so we can basically put all the natural world on shelves, so to say, and we can find a certain creature sitting on shelf number 5 from top, box number 15 from the right, something like this. So that in Linnaeus' mind, that was absolutely against the idea that all this beautiful system of nature can be one day messed up and substituted, changed into something else. So he said, if we see this beautiful branchings of life into plants separately, animals separately, within plants, seedless plants and gymnosperms and angiosperms, and within animals we see fishes and amphibians and reptiles. This is so ordered, and definitely there again, must be someone who gave all this order to nature, and definitely the someone is God the Creator. And again, uh, the if God exists, then logically you can safe to say that this all-powerful, all-wise, all-knowing creator created all biological species at about the same time, maybe on different days, but still within like 1 week. And he never changed this beautiful logical order that in which he created the life forms. Uh, at about the same time, again in the late 18th century, early 19th century, there lived a French naturalist uh, called Lamarck, Jean-Baptiste Lamarck. Lamarck was, he had a kind of difficult life and very adventurous career. He started as a military man. He was a noble, and he inherited from his father a horse, uh, a sword, and some, three copper coins. His father was initially very rich, but wasted all his belongings. He was a card player, etc. And Lamarck started as an adventurer. He enlisted in military and took part in many travels abroad. He fought as a cavalry soldier and then cavalry officer. Uh, and he saw many different places, many different countries with their peculiar life forms. And then he returned to his native France, and uh, when he was in his 50s, 60s, he became the keeper of the Royal Botanical Garden. And so again, he became, he gained access to thousands over thousands of forms of plants and also animals that lived in these botanical gardens. So he was a very keen observer, and he actually proposed an idea which was radically opposite to ideas of Linnaeus. Lamarck said, if we look at organization of particular body, of a particular animal, look how interesting this body is adapted to the environment where this animal lives. Right? So look at the giraffe. Giraffe has this unique long neck, and giraffes live in the savannah where trees do not have branches that stem from lower part of their trunk. They have branches that stem from upper part, and so giraffes are very well adapted to that. Because of their long neck, they can reach these highly growing branches with leaves that are higher up on bigger elevation from the earth. So why this adaptation? Uh, okay, yes, maybe the creator put certain forms of animals that he created into particular environments so that they could be better accommodated. But alternatively, maybe animals and maybe also plants and generally all forms of life evolved. They acquired these features that allow them to survive and thrive in particular environments. So a giraffe did not always exist the way we see it now. Some time ago, millions of years ago, there were animals that resembled giraffes, but they had regular neck. and then somehow they acquired this uh, long neck. So the species giraffe evolved. Uh, Lamarck elaborated on this, and he not only proposed that evolution occurs, he tried to develop a theory of evolution, basically asking, so why evolution? What is the cause of, what is the mechanism of evolution? And that, again, that was very revolutionary back then in the late 18th, early 19th century. Very few people asked questions like this. And like real scientist who is observing the world and advancing hypotheses and then making some effort to test these hypotheses. Lamarck followed this pattern. He followed the scientific method. So after his observation that particular animals, particular plants are adapted to particular environment, he hypothesized. He offered the central hypothesis that the evolution or diversification of life uh, occurs because life forms placed in a certain environment exercise to become fit to this environment. This word exercise, Lamarck loved it. He used it many, many, many times in different uh, sentences. He really tried to build everything around this concept of exercise. So how did the species giraffe evolve? At one point, look at this top figure. At some point, there were animals that had regular necks, and some of these animals, for some reason, liked to pick leaves from trees that had branches positioned high, and these particular like sub variety of giraffes stretched their necks very hard, trying to reach these leaves, and they bred, and their progeny inherited these slightly longer necks from their parents. Then again, the progeny became adult giraffes, and again, the cycle repeats. They wanted to pick leaves from branches that were even higher, and they stretched their necks and stretched their necks. And so in several generations, in many generations, there was a sub species of sub variant, some variety of giraffes kind of became different from the general population because of the exercise, because they stretched their neck. What can we say about now? Well, uh, about this now. There is, it's an elegant theory in a way, but it has one weak point. The acquired traits are not heritable. You see, you can exercise and grow muscle, big, build this mass of sculptured muscles, but it doesn't mean that your children will be born with better developed muscles than children of some person who never exercised. It just doesn't work that way. See, uh, the there is, we know that the basis of inheritance is actually DNA, right? And when you exercise in the gym, and you don't really change your DNA by that. No, you don't. Uh, so that was a weak link in Lamarck's theory, and actually, even back then, in the very early 19th century, in the 1810s, 1820s. Lamarck was still alive. There was one German scientist, a biologist, a naturalist, observer of nature, called August Weismann. He was a monk. He was living in a monastery, and he, as a person who can be concentrated on something for years and years and years and years, he challenged Lamarck's theory. And he said that if Lamarck's theory is correct, then let me make a prediction uh, of, if I take scissors and cut tails of mice of different sexes and make them breed, at some point in second, third, fourth, fifth generation of these mice with artificially cut tails, there will be newborn mice, right, which will have very short tails because, well, mice did not really exercise, but I kind of made them exercise and develop a short tail. And Weismann continued this experiment for something like 30 years. Patience, strong-willed determination of a scientist who was also a monk. And he wrote a treatise dismissing Lamarck. He said that I examined a group of mice which had regular tails. I cut their tails, made them breed. Then when newborn mice grew to the reproductive age, I cut their tails too, and so the third generation of mice were descendants of short tails mice, and then fifth and sixth and 15th and 27th generations, they were all descendants of mice that had short tails, and somehow they all were born with normal tails. Uh, then he also, very meticulous scientist. He said, well, I did observe a few newborn mice which developed into mice with very short tails, right? But I ran a control group of mice which were simply bred and left alone. I did not touch their tails. Their tails were all of the regular length, right? But in some 15th or 27th or 145th generation in that group, I also saw a few mice that had short tails, right? So in this case, uh, something else was the reason for these few animals that had short tails. It was not my intervention. It was not like I modeled mice that exercised to have short tails. No, it's something else. It's just, and well, we now know that it's basically random mutations which always produce some strange offspring, which has nothing really, absolutely nothing to do with exercise. So Lamarck's theory was not really forgotten. It was preserved as part of an interesting history of biology, but uh, it did not gain many supporters. Then, then came Darwin. See, Darwin was born when Lamarck still lived, 1809. Lamarck was already an aging man, and Darwin he grew up in his parents' estate in Shrewsbury. Uh, from early age, showed features of a nature lover. He loved long walks in the woods, and he hunted. He had an extremely good eyesight. He was literally from childhood. He was a good marksman, which meant that his eyes were really great at observing some small details. Then he became a student in Cambridge University. By the way, his what we would now call major was not biology, it was theology, and he graduated with a degree in theology and with the position of deacon at the Church of England. And he was hired to go for a voyage on board a ship that uh, traveled really all around the earth and made stops mostly in locations that were close to the equator. And especially one stop that this Royal Her Majesty the Beagle, it was the name of the ship, stop was Galapagos Islands. And Darwin's direct responsibility actually was to serve as a deacon on this ship and take care of spiritual needs of the crew. But he had this very strong attraction to living creatures, to living nature, to life. And he studied different life forms, and he was also a very good sketch artist. He drew the species, specimens that he observed. He had books full of his drawings with side notes, etc. This travel took about 2 years, I believe. Then Darwin returned to England, settled first I believe in Dublin and the Trinity College, and then in London, and he married his first cousin, which was a kind of dangerous, risky thing to do. First cousin, that's very close blood relative, and he was warned that he might have children with birth defects, etc. Well, they had 8 children, and all 8 children were all 8 children of Emma and Charles Darwin were healthy, grew up productive, intelligent, strong individuals. So he just proves this old wisdom that statistics is not something that gives you direct prediction. There is evidence that close blood relatives, on average, have bigger chance of producing a sickly environment, but that's just a possibility, probability. It's not what must happen and will happen. I mean, Darwin's family was really not fitting the statistics. Anyway, so Darwin, he was actually he did a lot of studies also in biology and in geology. He became a friend of Charles Lyell, who was the author of books in geology and developed the so-called catastrophe theories, saying that the non-living nature evolved by catastrophes. And so the landscape that we see now is not like the landscape that was on this planet millions of years ago. Now, and gradually, it took Darwin many years of thought and discussions with colleagues, friends. And Darwin was a very careful, cautious man. He did not want to publish his conclusions that he drew from describing species during his travels on the Beagle. For, well, about more than a dozen of years, he was still kind of not sure, not certain whether this is something interesting. It it happened. It turned out to be really interesting, but we will talk about it in just a moment. Let's now look at evidence of evolution. Uh, Aside from Darwin's collections of life forms and his conclusions based on observation of those life forms, we have some facts from simply observing the natural world which are consistent with the idea that life forms changed. Right? One of them is fossils, mineralized remains of organisms that lived millenniums ago. So we have the so-called fossil record. We can, for example, when we study animals, we can systematize fossils of animals that or life forms that we think are predecessors of the currently living animal species. And from this fossil record, it really does follow, it is very consistent with the idea that life forms were not exactly the same, uh, say 10 or 15 or 50 or 100 million years ago. They were somewhat similar to what we see now, but the more ancient they are, the less similar to the today's life they are. Now, how we judge about the age of fossils. Your textbook gives you a pretty good description of the method that is called radioactive dating, radioisotope dating. I will not go into details of how this is done. I just want to tell you guys one thing that's kind of useful to remember and use if you get into an argument with someone who totally denies evolution. And sometimes you hear people say, you don't really know how old these fossils are. Look at this radiometric dating. One laboratory showed that this fossil lived 55 million years ago, and another laboratory showed that it lived 43 or 53 million years ago. So that's a discrepancy, and it just tells you that scientists do not have evidence; they just make things up. You know. But radiometric dating is it is supposed to give certain to lead to certain discrepancies, not major discrepancies, but it is expected that there will be some inconsistency between data of two independent users of the same method, because it is statistical by nature. It is based on statistics. Uh, I can tell you my personal experience is with immunoenzymatic uh, quantitation of antibodies in a sample. And using a particular method, I can tell you that I personally observed uh, if you measure the amount of antibodies in the same tube today, using this immunoenzymatic method, you will get the answer that this tube contains 5 micrograms of antibody per milliliter. Do the same thing with the same reagents, with the same tube, same sample tomorrow, and you will arrive to the answer that there are 6 micrograms of antibody per milliliter. So 5 and 6. What to believe? Well, neither, actually. It's somewhere between. It's approximate. But you see, still, there is a difference between a fossil that lived 50 million years ago and a fossil that lived 1 billion years ago, right? It's just huge. That's real difference. And in this regard, all radiometric data are consistent with each other, although they can give some variety in particular dating. Okay, and the overall conclusion from the fossil record is that life on Earth changed or evolved, and uh, by interesting, important point here, by the mere nature of fossil studies, the fossil record cannot be complete. Again, some deniers of evolution, they argue that you have to have all the intermediate forms, right? Like if you argue that modern birds all originated or evolved from this ancient fossil that we call Archaeopteryx, this ancient uh, fossil of something that was between a bird and a dinosaur with wings, Archaeopteryx. You must show us all the intermediate forms, like how did this dinosaur change in a 1 million years, then 2 million years, then 3 million. So only by having a complete fossil record you can argue about evolution. But it, each, uh, each kind of biological study, inquiry, has its limitations. Fossil record has its limitation. It cannot be complete because, you see, fossils are not something that will always form. Fossils are not something that will form everywhere. For a dead animal to become a fossil, you need certain climate, you need dry climate, you need sand, right? If it's wet climate and a marsh, odds are that this dead animal will simply disintegrate and will not be preserved. So fossil record is incomplete. But there are other indications that evolution occurred. Biogeography. Uh, Interesting line of evidence in favor of evolution. So it says that certain life forms can be found only in certain places, certain geographical localities, suggesting adaptation to particular environment. Uh, it must be viewed in context of data of uh, paleogeologists, geologists who study uh, forming of entities like continents, islands, peninsulas, etc., etc. And the data from paleogeologists say that at one point of time the Earth had only one continent, Pangaea, or in some sources they call it Gondwana. So one big continent that occupied something like 1/3 of the entire surface of the planet Earth. And then because of some processes in the Earth crust and in the Earth mantle, uh, some movement occurred, and one huge continent, Pangaea, Pangaea, split into several. So some forms of life uh, actually evolved later than this event occurred. They evolved being already on separate continents and in particular localities where they had to adapt to a certain climate. So, for example, you cannot find a kangaroo in the state of Mississippi, right? Because marsupials like kangaroos, they are peculiar only to Australia and even more to certain locations in Australia. So they evolved later. They evolved after the fact of splitting this huge one continent into North America separately, South America separately, Africa separately, Eurasia separately, and Australia separately, and Antarctica separately. Uh, then comparative anatomy, yet another line of evidence in favor of evolution. Uh, if uh, life forms appeared all at once, then why do they have such uh, a homology, such a similarity in particular organs of their bodies? You see this picture on the left shows you uh, evolving arm and hand. And if you look at the right, from the right to left, the arm and hand of a bat was colossally different from your arm and hand. And yet there was homology. The bat had shoulder, forearm, wrist, and fingers. And you have shoulder, forearm, wrist, and fingers. And uh, in the history of life, if you compare different species, you will follow this same homology. The arm and actually the wing of a bat, which is the bat's arm and wrists and fingers. Uh, there is homology to uh, arms, so to say, and hands of whales. It's kind of strange even to think about whales having extremities, limbs with all these anatomical parts, but the fact is that whales do have them. They're just tiny compared to this huge body of whale, but they have something that is quite homologous to your uh, shoulder and forearm and wrist and fingers. And then mammals that are closer to us, um, cats have the very homologous structure of their uh, front and hind legs, and it's not shown here, but the shoulder and elbow and forearm and wrist and fingers of say, chimpanzee will be almost undistinguishable from yours. So there is homology, and it shows you that species that are further away from each other in appearance, in Linnaeus classification, have less homology. And the closer they are in Linnaeus classification, then the more homology they have. Also, comparative anatomy has records of embryonic development, and although I don't quite like this picture because the lower row of it showing embryos of human being. It's not. It's kind of like it's it's not photography. It's rather the the drawing skills and fantasy of the person who observed these stages of embryonic development. But still, you can see that all, if you compare a lizard, a fish, and a human, all these radically different species have similarities between their embryos taken at a certain stage. And the, the later is the term of the embryo, the less it resembles other species, and the more it resembles this particular species, lizard or fish or human. So embryonic development kind of reiterates the history of the species. And finally, one modern evidence of evolution comes from what we call bioinformatics. Uh, Bioinformatics is a relatively new branch of biological sciences. It started to form in the 1970s, 80s, when people learned how to establish sequences of nucleotides in the DNA. But then with the development of technology, it this originally very field of studies that included small numbers of people working in very advanced laboratories, it mushroomed, and it's a huge field because the technological devices that are used for sequencing DNA are now so powerful that you can sequence, for example, about 10,000 samples in one run. So you have, for example, you have a tube and it has a mixture of DNAs in it. Right? You put this tube in a holder of mass spectrometer and press the button, and in I don't know, couple of hours, you have 10,000 DNA sequences, particular, well separated from each other. You can compare them, you can calculate similarity or discrepancy, etc. And what this massive sequence of DNA showed, again, the same logic as in the comparative anatomy studies. The further are the species from each other by appearance, by geography, by Linnaeus classification, the smaller is the homology in the DNA sequence. Like old world monkey, see in the bottom of this of this drawing, it has only about, well, 92.5, maybe 93% similarity to your DNA. Still, it's very similar, but it's not 100%. And then the closer you go to the species Homo sapiens, the more homology you see. In orangutans, it's what, 96% homology, and in human compared to chimpanzee, it's something like 98.2% homology. So very close to 100% homology in the sequence of DNA. So this is a powerful evidence again that there was a certain kind of rationally directed change in the forms of life, which produced forms that are similar to each other and different from older and further, standing further in classification species of animals and plants and fungi and whatever. Now let's go back to Darwin. So Darwin, of course, Darwin was not familiar with bioinformatics. Certainly, he was very familiar with biogeography and with comparative anatomy, and he thought in categories of those fields of studies, but he made his own observation, and he advanced a hypothesis that was really revolutionary. see, what he observed many different variants within species, especially when he traveled in Galapagos Islands. He, for some reason, his mind was almost obsessed with studying finches. Uh, this look at these finches. One, two, three, four different forms, right? They are apparently different. They belong to the same species of birds, finches. But they are different. There is a variation. Darwin liked this term, variation. Some finches have shorter beaks, others have longer beaks, yet others have beaks that are big and crooked, and yet others had beaks that are light colored. And so different, like there's a variation in the appearance of finches. Why did it occur? And look, here's a very important thing. Uh, uh, Many people who have some idea about the concept of evolution but do not really go into details of it, they think that these forms appeared because finches adapted to different environments. No, said Darwin, no, that has nothing to do with their particular environment. It's genetics, it's inheritance, it's inheritance. Darwin did not use terms genes and mutations because he worked in the 1830s, 40s, way earlier than Mendel with his concept of genes as units of inheritance. Darwin did not know any of that, but his basic claim was that there exists some variation in the forms within one biological species. This variation has nothing to do with the environment, is not acquired by individual animals, finches in this case. It is just the result of some processes that we have no control over. We don't even know what these processes are. Finches are just born that way. Right? So and they produce progeny which is like them, right? So it's not like one finch in a large group of finches has this light-colored beak. No, there are these finches children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren who inherit from their parents this uh, peculiar color of the beak, or peculiar shape, peculiar size of a beak. It's not because they exercised, no. How can exercise influence on color, for example? This is just inconceivable. No, it's just what Darwin also used one very uh, sort of enigmatic term. Uh, uh, Undetermined variability. Undetermined variability. So in all, if you study any group of individuals, be it plants or fungi or humans or animals, you will always see certain forms that are not like majority. There are always some uh, like you study like 100 shrubs that all belong to the same species of plants, and you measure the height of the shrub and say it's 1 yard, 1 yard and 2 inches, 1 yard, 1 yard, 1 yard, and suddenly 10 inches or 8 inches. So and you cannot explain why. It's not like this plant decided to become short. No, it's just something in the inheritance mechanisms which in the time of Darwin was not known. So he called it in or undetermined variation. Now, in a certain environment, the individuals that fit this environment better get more resources and leave more progeny. What here comes the cardinal concept, survival of the fittest. Imagine that uh, in the Galapagos Islands, uh, some there were some changes in climate or weather or whatever, the chemical composition of the soil, some environmental changes, and because of that, the bark of trees where these finches got their food, which is small insects hiding underneath the bark, uh, they kind of faced this sudden change that the bark became hard. And of these finches, which one do you think will be more successful in finding insects that are hiding in this thick, hard kind of tree bark? Definitely those who have longer beaks, right? And beaks that are shaped in such a way that they uh, can penetrate into little spaces between bark. So they will get more insects, they will be fed better, and being better fed means being more active, defending yourself better from predators, right? And also living longer, important part, and having more children. So those variants which just occurred, we don't know why, but they happened to be better fit for a particular environment, which is always changing. Right? They, at this moment, when they are better fit to their environment, they live longer and they produce more progeny. So Darwin used this term, reproductive success. Right? The imagine that because of the fitness of the beak to the bark, the finch that is in the upper left corner lived 1 year, and both finches in the bottom row lived half a year, but the finch that is in the upper right corner, because of the shape of that finch's beak, lived longer, lived maybe 2 or 3 years, and produced, well, tens of times, dozens of times more progeny than those unsuccessful finches. So what's going to happen to this group of finches in a year, 2 years, 3 years, 5 years from now, 10 years from now? Definitely the number of finches which have the beak shaped like the beak of the finch in the upper right corner will increase, right? Uh, it's heritable. The children inherit the shape of the beak from the father, uh, not because the father exercised or mother exercised, but because the father or the mother or both of them just happened because of some factors that are beyond our control and understanding back in Darwin's times, uh, just happened to be better fit to the particular environment. Right? And this is the whole point of Darwin's explanation of the mechanism of evolution. He said that evolution occurs because uh, groups of animals, groups of plants, groups of fungi, whatever kind of life, have inherent variation. And when climate changes in a particular way, or when soil composition changes in a particular way, or whatever, if there is a change in the environment, then certain or representatives of a certain variant of all these variants receive advantage. They did not earn this advantage. They they came what they are simply because of some play of factors in the inheritance that Darwin certainly did not understand, did not even attempt to understand. But just because of some circumstances, uh, they developed into what they developed, and they happened to be more uh, fit to this particular environmental change. They withstood this change. They thrived in it. They produced more children, so the number of their kind increased. Right? And on the other hand, some unhappy finch with short beak, which cannot penetrate into this hole. This finch was okay when the bark of the trees was soft, but it's not okay now. It it cannot get enough food. It uh, becomes weak and sickly and not as well protected from predators, not maybe that smart, and it lives a shorter life. It still may live to reproductive age. It does have offspring, but not as numerous as the offspring of the successful finch. Right? So that's basically the idea of natural selection according to Darwin. Natural selection means that the environment selects particular variants of forms of life which simply happened to be better fit to this environment. We will return to this concept of groups of individuals which are representatives of a certain species, which are called populations. Next lecture we will find out what is a population and why we say that what evolves is a population. All right, see you then.